And welcome to the Google Hangout with Laura Moriarty, the author of The Center of Everything, the KU Common Book for 2014-2015. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you very much.
Like you, Laura is a Jayhawk, having earned both a degree in social work and an MA in creative writing from the University of Kansas. She currently serves as an associate professor of creative writing at KU. She's written 4 books. Getting there. We have a little bit of technical difficulty. Just sit tight with us for a second, and we are a go now. So let me reintroduce Laura Moriarty, and welcome again to the Google Hangout with author Laura Moriarty, the author of The Center of Everything, the 2014-2015 KU Common Book. So, like you, Laura is a Jayhawk, and she's earned degrees in social work and an MA in creative writing from the University of Kansas. She is an associate professor of creative writing, and she's written 4 books and is currently at work on her next one. So thank you for being here today. If you want to introduce yourself, Laura?
I'm Laura, and I'm happy to hang out with you. Yeah, thanks. This is fun. So thanks for tuning in.
Wonderful. And we're joined today by 3 KU students who are live on the Google Hangout, and we want to give them a chance to introduce themselves now. Let's start with Kelsey.
Hi, I'm Kelsey. I'm from Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, and I'm majoring in environmental science.
Oh, great.
And where are you today? Tell me, are you in your room, at home? Where are you?
Yeah, I'm in my room at my house.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here. Jessica.
My name's Jessica Gilbo. I'm from Kansas City, Kansas, but right now I'm in Lawrence. And I'm a sophomore majoring in management and leadership in the business school. I was also an orientation assistant, so there's that.
Thank you for being here, Jessica. And
Yep.
Chase.
How's it going? My name is Chase Allison. I am from Overland Park, Kansas. I'm going to be a freshman at KU, and I will be studying civil engineering with an environmental concentration.
Great.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here, Chase. And for those viewing at home, you have an opportunity to submit questions for Laura via Twitter using the hashtag KU Common Book. Let me hold that better. Hashtag KU Common Book, and please send those in. So we're going to take questions under various, let me position that so you can see it on camera. We're going to take questions under various themes throughout the conversation. And the first theme that we want to ask Laura some questions about concerns its inspiration and motivations. So tell us about some of the decision-making processes that you went through while writing the book, Laura. What were your inspirations and motivations for this book?
Okay, well, I graduated from KU, as you said, with a degree in social work, and I was working in Kansas City, Kansas as a social worker. So actually, at that point, I hadn't graduated yet. It was my practicum. Your practicum year, if you major in social work, you go to classes Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, at least at the time you did. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, they would sign you up so you actually worked with other social workers and got out into the field and got to start practicing what you were learning. And I was working at Duchesne Clinic in Kansas City, right across the street from Memorial Hall. And it was a clinic where Kansas City physicians and nurses and physician's assistants would donate their time to help people who couldn't afford medical care. And then there were a bunch of nuns there. It was a Catholic place, so the nuns were either nurses, physician's assistants, or also social workers. And so I was assigned a nun, and on the very first day, no, it wasn't the first day, but it was a very, very hot day. And I was still learning and just a student, and taking notes. And I'm like, 21 years old, and a woman came in with 5 kids, and it was hot, and she'd walked the whole way, and the conversation between this woman and the nun got really tense really quickly, and some of you might recognize that from chapter 7, because I went home and I started writing about it just to sort of process it and think about it, and then I got pretty interested in writing, and I remember taking that chapter I signed up for a creative writing class at KU for an evening class, and by now I was working as a social worker full-time, and my creative writing teacher said, oh, you should expand this. I would like to know what happened to this these people before that day and after this day. So I got rid of the other kids because it was too confusing, and I just told it from Evelyn's point of view. So that's how it got started. And like right away, that was the first decision I made, make her, there aren't 4 other kids, there's just her, to tell it from her point of view. And really, like you said, I mean, writing a novel and writing anything is all about just making one decision after another. You just constantly making decisions. You can do this, you can do that. And that's, I think, why a blank page is so scary. But you can just, you just keep making decisions, and you can't worry about if they're always the right ones. They're just the ones you make.
Yeah. Let's take a question from Kelsey or Chase or Jessica. Go ahead, Kelsey. I can see you ready to ask a question. Go ahead.
Okay. Which character do you think you relate to the most, like out of all the characters?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because really there's some of me in all of them. And I find what I like to do is I don't make them autobiographical. Like I would never say that, Evelyn is me, or that I had her life in any way. My life was really different in some ways. But there are definitely scenes from her adolescence that are scenes of me. And so there is a lot of me in Evelyn. At the same time, there's a lot of me in the mom.
Okay.
I can relate to Mr. Goldman. I can relate to, I've been in so many situations where other people, so there's a lot of times characters are sort of hybrids of me and other people, me and people I don't like. There are times where I'm a little bit of Tracy, and I remember that and how that felt. And so I think all different people are in there. And what I try to do with my characters, I think there's a scene early on where Evelyn is eating meat. Mm-hmm. And I've been a vegetarian since I was 10, and I do that in almost all my books. The character's like gnawing on a pork chop or something, and that's like a cue to me that it is. So that frees me up a little bit, although a lot of the feelings Evelyn feels I felt, and then a lot of the things the mother says, not everything, but some of the things the mother says are things that I would say.
Okay, yeah.
I feel like I want to ask a follow-up, which is you said Tracy. Do you see yourself in Tracy too? Do you want?
Yeah.
Can you kind of expand on that? And
well, I think there's that scene, where Tracy says she's sorry, and Evelyn is so cynical at this point that she's thinking, oh, she just wants me to vote for her or whatever.
Yeah.
And she won't. But it's that realization that you did something bad when you were young and hurt yourself, and you didn't realize how mean it was.
Right.
And then as you get older, you develop more empathy, and you start to think, oh, that was bad, And so I think Evelyn realizes that too later on, that she was not always, the nicest person herself,
Right.
And so even as she was being the victim, she was perpetrating a little bit too.
Right.
Yeah.
Jessica or Chase, a question?
I have a question about the love aspect of the book. So what motivated you to even include a love story in the book? Because it wasn't focused on love the whole time, but yeah.
I could just see the story developed in this case. I can really say with my other novels, I have an outline and a plan and I think about it. But I will say, my other novels, not all of them, but a lot of my other novels do have love stories running through them. And I don't know, I mean, some of my favorite books have that. I love Thomas Hardy, and sometimes they're very tragic love stories. Like in this case, it's not a happy love story, right? I don't want to ruin the end, but it's not, you get married, right? I mean, that's not happening. So it's I do think that kind of attachment and disappointment is a real force in making some people grow. People change a lot, especially when it doesn't work out. If you really grow attached to someone and love someone, whether or not it works out, it can be a huge change in your life. And so I was interested, because I was interested in a girl changing over time. It seemed like she needed that kind of powerful experience.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
And I want to just encourage Chase, Jessica, Kelsey, go ahead and jump in at any time. You don't have to wait for me to call on you. As we get, I'm going to throw my pencil. As we get rolling along, just jump in anytime, okay?
Okay.
I do have a specific question. In Chapter 8, and I guess it could have been symbolic in a way, and maybe not in others, but why is the Church of the Second Arc in a roller rink as opposed to in an actual church?
Yeah. Well, the short answer to that is I really did have to go to a church that was in a roller skating rink in Montana, and it really lasted 3 hours, and that's all taken right out of true life, you know. And I just remembered the disco ball turning. But it was sort of a poor shoestring church. It wasn't an established church. And so I have had readers ask when I've done readings for this, you know, why not make it, you know, why make it almost a caricature of a church? You know, why not make it a more mainstream church, or a church with a little bit more, you know, money, where it would have its own building, or maybe not so extreme. But really, I think Evelyn, at that point, when she starts grasping for the Church of the Second Arc, she is at such a low point in her life. You know, her mother has really made some bad decisions and left her with zero stability. And so I think at that point in her life, she is not interested in a church that asks questions. She's interested in a church that will give her answers, and that would be a fundamentalist church. And a fundamentalist church, they tend to be more, you know, shoestring budgets. They tend to be poorer because they're more on the fringe of society. And so to me, it made sense that it would be in a roller skating rink. You know, this isn't First Methodist downtown. This is, you know, one of those churches that is kind of extreme and out there, but they are giving her answers. If you do this, you will be okay. And that's what she wants to hear more than anything at that point in her life.
That's interesting.
Thank you.
You know, I'll jump in and ask a question. One of the, on hashtag KU Common Book, one of the questions that's been repeated, or comments or subjects of the book that seems to be drawing the attention of a lot of students, is the way that the novel ends.
Yeah.
And so, potential spoiler alert, we'll see where the conversation goes, but I think students would like to know why you ended the novel the way you did.
Yeah. You know, I get that a lot, and I'm always a little mystified by it, because to me, I mean, if I'm proudest of anything with the book, it's the ending, which I know some are like, what happens? And I think, what did you want? Like, I would want to ask the students, what is it more that you need to know? Well, what is it that wasn't answered? Because, you know, there's not going to be a banquet or a wedding at the end. You know, it's not that kind of book where, you know, everything's going to be wrapped up or the problem solved. But the major questions in the book, I think, are solved, because from the beginning I wanted to write a book about a young woman's moral and intellectual coming of age. You know, I think so many coming of ages, for women, especially for females, they really focus on the physical and sexuality. And so I really wanted to write a book that was about her moral and intellectual. And so by the end of the intellectual, you know, she's going to college. But even more than that, you know, she has really found her moral compass by the end. You know, that scene with Travis at the end, and that's a real fork in the road. And she could go either way at that point. You know, she's so mad. She wants what she wants, you know, and that is how so many people get tripped up. You know, statistically, it makes sense that Evelyn would get pregnant too, right? Because she's raised by a single mom. But she doesn't. She makes these decisions, and at the same time, she's being so much nicer to her mom. She's being so much nicer to Dina. She's really found her compassion and also her strength and her sense of where she wants to go. And, you know, Travis and Dina, it's not a happy ending. You know, there is no happy ending right there. I mean, it could get better for them. If I were going to write a sequel, it would be about Travis and Dina, you know, because I'm interested, you know, their lives can improve too. But I feel like Evelyn's just an arrow. You know where she's going to go, because she's straight on at this point. She just has to make it out. And when she makes that decision with Travis in the car, she's made it.
Well, what about that question that Laura asked you, students? What do you think students, and maybe this is you, or maybe you have a sense of this, why do students, why are they questioning the end of the novel, do you think? You know, as Laura said, she doesn't understand that always, that students seem to think about the end of the novel and closure and such. Do you have a sense of, or do you yourself have a question about the end of the novel?
Well, I think, like, you get so emotionally invested in the characters that you kind of want to know, like, does Evelyn end up liking KU? Does she do well there? And even, like, I really liked Dina a lot. Dina was my favorite character. And, like, I find it interesting, like, does everything work out with Dina and Travis? Does Dina, do they break up? And it's just, like, it's unanswered questions, so.
Why was Dina your favorite character? Sorry, Laura.
No, that's
I liked Dina because even though, like there's some points where you want to dislike her with the whole Travis thing and how Evelyn liked Travis, but she has this, like, innocence to her, and everything she does just seems really sweet and not like she's trying to hurt anybody. So even though she gets pregnant with Travis, I still like her the whole time.
I am so glad to hear you say that, because a few reviewers would really be dismissive of Dina. They'd talk about, oh, they like Evelyn so much, and then her dim friend Dina, like just flattening her out, and it hurt me because I love Dina so much too. And Dina, as I said, if I were going to write a sequel, it would be about Dina, because she is a little bit like the mom, you know what I mean, where she has this potential, she's really, really screwed up, but she's a good mother, and she, who knows what's going to happen. She has this artistic intelligence that Evelyn doesn't have, so even though in some ways, yes, she's dim, I'm a big believer in different kinds of intelligence, so who knows when she'll find her footing, and she might find her footing in the future. But because this was Evelyn's book, I really focused on her arc, and I feel like at the end, I think, what more do you need to know about Evelyn? Like, she has made every decision that shows which way she's headed. And I did write more. I think they were joking that, like, I turned in my thesis, the book in a bag, and it was 600 pages. And that actually followed Evelyn to KU and all her, exploits of the first year. But it kind of lost its momentum. And really, I think, how could she not love it once she got here? I mean, how intellectually curious she is. How kind of bottled up she's been. Living in Caryville, and so now she gets to go off into this wide world where everything that she's about is going to be reinforced. She's going to get to go to Costa Rica. She's going to get to learn all this stuff. She's going to meet people who have values more like hers, and yet she's still rooted and loves her mom and isn't so judgmental, and so she's better all around. I just have the highest hopes in the world for her. I think she's going to be fine.
And we actually have a question in from Chance on Twitter. And he wants to know what was the symbolism behind the storm at the end of the novel.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I was thinking a lot when I was writing this book. I did research on Reagan and the Reagan era. And so even though Evelyn is about my age, and I remember that his speech at the Republican nominating convention, and he really did say this thing about America being a light between the two oceans on purpose. And Evelyn is watching that, and because, as I said before, with the fundamentalist church, she's somebody who wants answers in times of instability and chaos, which is much like our nation, I think. In times of instability and chaos, we don't want nuance. We want, this is the way it is. And we want to hear, this is the light shining down on you because you're America and you're better than everybody else and you're more important. And, that's running throughout the Bible. That's running through a lot of our national psyche as well. And I think as the book goes on, she starts to think about the light moving around.
Yeah.
And so, that's some of the symbolism of the last line. But it's also, the book is quite a bit about religion. And she goes from being this fundamentalist to really starting to question it, and especially the literal interpretation of the Bible. However, I really meant Samuel to be sort of this nuance to that question, because she's not exactly an atheist at the end, or at least I don't mean the book to be atheistic, because one thing I learned when I worked with people with disabilities for a long time after I graduated, and they always would tell us, I worked at Community Living Opportunities here in Lawrence, and they would really emphasize, don't watch the way you talk around the men and women, because even if someone to you looks like, a vegetable, like they're not hearing or listening, you don't know if they can hear or listen. You can't tell, you don't know what's going on. And I would kind of think, oh, okay, but after a while, you want to start, it's really human nature, I think, to start acting like someone's a chair or something if they don't ever interact or look at you. And then you would have these moments where, after working with someone for 6 months or so, you would make a joke or something and you'd see like a half smile, or you're watching something sad on TV and you'd see a tear. And they were hugely humbling moments, like moments that were, the closest I think I've experienced to like a spiritual experience, that humbling moment of even me with my sort of rational scientific leanings, that we don't know everything, that just because you can't measure it and see it doesn't mean it's there. And so with Samuel, he is that mystery, like you don't know what's in him, and the mother believes and Evelyn doesn't, and so it's sort of this weird, mix up of what they were before with the fundamentalism. But, he knows the school bus is coming. Like, they think he's not really in there, and the mom says he knows it's coming. He does know it's coming. Like, he knows that, and he knows the storm is coming later. He knows it's coming, and he wants to go outside.
Yeah.
And so she takes him out, and I think it's sort of that humbling experience of, even for someone with a scientific bent like Evelyn, which I think is good, to still be open to these things we don't yet understand.
It's really interesting to hear you talk about the religious subject or aspects of the book, and then Samuel's education together. And we have another Twitter question from Yang. How important, which is along those lines, how important was establishing a sense of realism when constructing the events of the novel?
Yeah, not as important. That's a good question. Not as important as they are to me now. You know, I read the book for the first time in 14 years.
Wow.
Yesterday. Well, you know, I don't want to read my own work, you know, because, well, one, it drives you crazy.
Okay.
Because you're like, oh, I can't change it. I can't change anything. No, you know, because I think if you're a writer, you just want to revise, and you can't revise it because it's already there. You know, you've turned it in. It's like looking at a paper you've already turned in. You know, it's just going to make you insane. Right. Or an email you've already sent. Right. Don't look at it. But so that's one reason I don't like to read them. But the other thing is there's so many books by other authors I want to read. I don't want to just sit there reading my own work. I think I told you I worry about Prince only listening to his own music. But, you know, one thing I noticed reading it is I don't know if I paid as much attention to realism as I do now. Like, I do read some of it, and it does seem a little fantastical in spots. And others, I think, would they really do that? Would that really happen? And, you know, at the same time, I'm fine with what I wrote at the time, and a lot of readers connect with that. But I could see where it's not as truly grounded in realism. Although it was funny because the press kind of called it gritty and realistic, which I see it as my least realistic novel in some ways.
I have to ask a follow-up question, and I hope this is a fair question. So now that you've reread it for the first time in 14 years, if there was something
everything.
You would change everything.
Well,
I didn't even need to finish that.
Yeah,
you knew exactly what I was talking about.
It's kind of maddening, you know, because it's at the same time I don't want to diss it. You know what I mean? Right. I don't want to say, oh, it's horrible, you know, because I wrote that and I remember writing it, and sometimes I read it and I think, oh my God, I came up with that, and how all the themes come together, and how did I do that, you know? And then I think it's like anybody who's kept a diary, and you go back and you read it and you think, oh, right? like I would change phrasings, I would change scenes, I would do it all differently just because, you know, you change and grow and you learn as a person. That doesn't mean that I regret it. It's just acknowledging that it would be different now, you know. Okay. I think my writing has changed a little bit, for better or for worse, I don't know. You know, it was just, I think it's gotten a little more subtle. Mm-hmm. But there are things that I do love about this book, you know, and I don't know, maybe I keep using the metaphor, I don't know if it's bad or not, but it's like having a kid, you know, where you look back and you think, oh, I would have done this differently, and at the same time, you know you were doing the best you could, you know? Yeah. Yeah.
With your daughter sitting in the audience
like,
here. Let's move to a different theme and talk about characters and setting, maybe. And I think I'll turn first to the Google Hangout to Kelsey and Jessica and Chase. Do you have any questions on characters or setting for Laura?
Yeah, my favorite character in the book was the mom, just because I liked going through the emotion of like disliking her and liking her and like getting angry.
Sure.
So why like, why did you make the mother the way that she was? Like, did you intend to pull the audience in the way that, like, I just described?
You mean because she made bad decisions?
She made bad decisions, and like there are times where like, oh my gosh, she's a really good mother, like I can see the kindness in her, but at the same time there would be other times where she would do things and you're like, but why would you? And so did you intend for it to be an emotional roller coaster? And like, who did you base the mother off of, basically?
Well, she started out, she was that mother I met when I was a social worker, and that woman actually got up and stormed out of the nun's office with her 5 kids back out into the heat without getting help for them. And I was so frustrated with her. I was like, why would she do that? Why would she do that? You know, because now we can't help them, and worrying about the kids, and, you know, she's a bad mom. And then I tried to think, okay, you know, one thing we learn in social work that really helps me as a writer is really trying to empathize and think about why people behave the way they do. And so she sort of grew like that, where she is sometimes a really good mom, as you said. And then I think with Tina, her backstory wound, you know, is her dad and the way he thinks about her. And also I think her appearance, she has really relied on her beauty and her sexuality to get what she wants. And now, you know, it backfires, as it does with Dina later, you know. And she's kind of now in this bad position where she feels bad about herself, and she's always sort of used her beauty to get ahead, but now she's this mom and it's not really working, and she's, you know, her system isn't working anymore. And so, but rather than just leave her as this flat, bad mom, I wanted to sort of say, well, this is how she's good and this is how she could get better. And I think that's true of most people. And my favorite literary characters are the ones you can't quite pin down as like, this person's all good and this person's all bad. You know, like Eileen is good and Eileen is bad. Almost everybody in the book is a little good and a little bad.
That's cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciated Tina and how she was kind of on a full spectrum of emotions, and I really loved kind of reading and contrasting between her as a character and then the other characters in the book, because you see people that are really genuinely open-minded in the book, like Evelyn, as she turns out to be. She is genuinely observant and intelligent, and sometimes you see that against her mom, who is very narrow, very keen on one thing.
You think her mom is keen on one thing, or her grandmother?
Tina. Like, I mean, there are sections in the book where, you know, we're leaving now. Like when they were at their her Evelyn's grandfather's, her father's place. We're leaving no matter what. It's a set deal, and you're kind of locked in on one thing. Right. You know, I think you need those characters who are almost like unresolved in a way, because that's how you put the most character and the most full body into their into the novel. I think that's why I love Tina the most, because she made mistakes.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, Tina, she has that terrible temper, and it's her big flaw, and it really is what makes her a bad mother for the first third of the book, because she storms out of the dad's, like you said, the grandfather's house, and then she storms out again at the social worker's office, and it causes big problems, you know, and then she does the real, you know, she maybe gets pregnant on purpose, you know, with Mr. Mitchell, and like not a good idea, you know, she kind of makes these impulsive decisions, and it's based on low self-esteem, it's based on, you know, not feeling good about herself, but I do remember, and you were asking me earlier about decisions I made. Yeah. And I started writing about this baby, and all of a sudden this baby becomes disabled, you know, and I just started writing because I think I was working part-time already with disabled people. And I was really struck by the parents of the people I met, and also the people I met, the actual men and women I worked with. And I realized it would be a real chance for her to grow. And I remember somebody in a workshop I took saying, are you sure you should do this? It seems like you're just piling it on this woman. You know, Tina's already had all these problems, and now, you know, why does the baby have to be disabled? I was like, well, because sometimes the baby is disabled, and maybe this is going to be, and it turned out it was exactly what she needed to kind of rise into this new sense of herself and become powerful in this completely new and unexpected way, because then she becomes a great mom.
Yeah. You mentioned Mr. Mitchell, and actually we have another Twitter question from Jessica. What ever happened to Mr. Mitchell?
He just moved away.
He just moved away.
He just moved away. Yeah, he just, and that might be, I don't know if it's, you know, yeah, I think things like that do happen, you know. I don't know if he knew, you know, but he decided to work things out with his wife, and so the plot did not work. If that's what it was, it might have been a subconscious plot on Tina's part, but he made his choice.
Other character questions from our Google Hangout participants?
I have another question about what happened to a character. Whatever happened to Travis's dad?
Good question.
And he just left too. You know, and I do. You know, people do that. I'm familiar with that, and people do just leave sometimes. And he left, and you know, that's an interesting situation where he takes one kid and not the other, and he gives that, which seems so cruel, right? It seems so cruel, but. He gives that explanation that Travis is having all these problems. He's got to be staying with relatives. He doesn't want to start drinking again, so he's got to get into this new situation. And so you can kind of see why in his mind it might make sense, but of course it's so harmful to take one kid and leave the other, and what that does to Travis. And I did have a writing teacher early on who told me that you know, it's helpful to think about biblical stories or mythology or sort of these large, powerful stories that remain with us for thousands of years. And so at the very beginning, when you meet Travis and his brother, they're fighting, and one of them flies out the door and is grabbing onto the ankle of the other. So it's, in my mind, it's Jacob and Esau. And it's not as if anyone reading that is going to go, oh my gosh, it's Jacob and Esau. But to me, it's sort of set into that dynamic between him that Travis is the one who got left behind. Travis is Esau, you know, that embittered one who wasn't chosen to go along.
I think we have, well, let me ask a question about let me ask a question about Caryville. Let's talk about Caryville. Well,
Okay.
first off, am I pronouncing that correctly?
I always said Caryville, but maybe it's
Caryville.
Caryville because it doesn't exist.
Okay. So Caryville, let's talk about Caryville.
Okay.
What's the motivation for that setting, and why does it attract the people that it does?
Yeah. You know, I grew up mostly, my dad was in the military, so we moved around a lot, but I grew up mostly in Bozeman, Montana, which at the time had a population of about 18,000. And now I hear it's very glamorous, but at the time it wasn't super glamorous. You know, it was just a normal town and not surrounded by a lot of empty space. And you know, it seemed a little bit like Ottawa, a little bit like Emporia, and so I just sort of imagined her living somewhere kind of off the grid. And as far as setting goes, this might be interesting to people, but when I was really having an easier time writing about Kansas after I left it. I really loved Lawrence when I got here. And then I remember I got that fellowship in New Hampshire, and it was a prep school, and they were really good to me. But you know, everybody there went to Harvard or Yale, like that was where they were all, you know, it was a shop to go. And all the stuff was in the news about Kansas, about the evolution stuff.
Right.
You know, the first week I was there, the Phelps came up to protest something, so it was just like great PR, you know. And I would say, I'm from Kansas, and people would go, oh my God, what's it like to live there, you know? And I really tried to think about that. What is it like to live there? You know, Lawrence is different experience than living in some of these smaller towns throughout Lawrence. But I really wanted to sort of show that it's maybe more varied than people outside of it think.
We've got another Twitter question. So
Okay.
Megan on Twitter says, I saw Travis as a foil for Evelyn. They're both really intelligent, but obviously his life turns out very different from hers. How did you develop his character and his and Evelyn's friendship?
Yeah, he is, you're right that he is so much like Evelyn, and he just has worse luck in some ways. You know, he's kind of the doppelganger character of what could have happened to her, and he realizes it at the end, and he sort of has that weird double agenda where he says, I should be the one going, you know, because he was just as smart as she was, but just as he was starting to get out, he got trapped.
Right.
And, you know, who knows what's going to happen with them. Like, I would not write off Dina and Travis forever. I don't think that they would stay together, but I think that they could find new happiness and change. But in this book, he's the tragic story. And the first time I wrote the book, Evelyn was the tragic story, you know? Evelyn makes the same mistakes, and because I was really thinking about the cycle of poverty and everything I'd seen in social work, but you know, I don't know, it didn't seem like something Evelyn would do. It seemed more like a social work soapbox than really thinking about this particular character and how strong she was. I do think Travis was strong too, but he didn't quite make it out.
Well, I know Kelsey wants to ask now. You just said that Travis and Dina probably aren't going to make it. Why won't Travis and Dina make it?
Well, they won't make it as a couple.
Okay.
I would say no. I mean, maybe, but they're not right for each other, you know, and they just got together too young, and she got with him for the wrong reasons. She was clinging, and he wants to go, and maybe they'll stick it out for the kid. I don't know what's going to happen with them, but when I was thinking about a sequel, I was sort of thinking of them apart, you know.
Okay. Great. Yeah. Other questions from our Google Hangout participants about characters or setting?
I have a question too about Evelyn, actually.
Okay.
When you were writing it, I found it interesting because you can really feel her grow up. Like, you start out, you see everything through her eyes, and even like when the mom got pregnant and she was like, oh, I was just jumping on the bed. So you see like this whole, like, how were you able to write and have her grow up?
I did think about it quite a bit, you know, and I tried to get it right and think what words would she use and what images she would have and how much information she would know. And it's interesting because now I have a 10-year-old and she's much savvier than I was when I was 10. But I thought back to how I thought when I was 10 and what I knew and didn't know and didn't understand the way I thought things worked. Now, in this day and age, she would be much more advanced of her thinking and knowledge and vocabulary even than I would be. But I tried to kind of measure it along my own growth in the way I could think about things and the way, and not just vocabulary, but the complexity of thoughts, or like you said, just the knowledge of how things work. You know, she becomes more cynical, but she also becomes much more compassionate at the end, I think, as she's able to take in conflicting information and not be such a zealot. You know, I think that stage where she's 14 through 18 is when she's, like right around 14, is when she's the meanest to her mom, and she's this little tyrant fundamentalist in her room, and I feel bad for her, but she's also kind of unbearable at that age because she's so judgmental and harsh of everyone.
Unfortunately, I think that, I can relate to that, and,
Sure.
that seems to be a period when, me and my experience and friends seem a little distant from parents sometimes.
Yeah.
It comes back
Yeah.
at the end. I think I actually told a story at orientation this summer where my mother said to me when I was 18, "You haven't talked to me in 2 years," after I came back from a trip where I went out and then came back and had more confidence. From that trip, I learned some things. I met some people who weren't in my small town. So I grew up in a small town too. So,
Yeah.
other questions from the Google Hangout participants about characters and setting? Maybe we have time for one more question in this area.
Did you? I feel like overall the male characters in the book were kind of had like a negative light towards them. Was that intentional, or I mean, is that correct? Like,
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think Travis is a pretty sympathetic, and character. But yeah, I can see because there's the grandfather, right? There's
Right.
Mr. Mitchell, who's kind of nice, but then, and he's not terrible, right? Because you could argue he doesn't really know, and so they're sort of human. And the way the female characters are kind of just as
just
I don't know if maybe it's because it's a female-focused book that those characters are more developed. But I would say, to me, with the exception of the grandfather, the men and the women actually are equally flawed, and equally dynamic. But I do see that. I think I grew up with sisters, and so I was sort of writing in that comfort zone. And as my new books, I think I have more men and more depictions of men in them. But at the same time, the female characters are all pretty flawed too, and that grandfather, as bad as he is willing to help. He's just very, very much in his own mind and his value system of the way things should work. And then there's Mr. Goldman is a very positive force.
right? He's a good guy.
So there's some other ones. So I think it does balance out, because even Eileen, she's bad and good. In some ways she's wonderful, and in other ways she's really destructive. And terrible. She says really mean things to Tina. She says crazy things to Evelyn, and you can't fall in line with that kind of thinking, no matter how many sweaters she knits you, because Evelyn realizes it's not a good way to think.
We're going to shift to some questions about writing, because we always want to choose a common book that is interesting because of the subject matter and what it tackles and covers, but also because it's well written. And what we can learn about the act of writing from our common books. So I'll start, and then we can go to Twitter questions and also with our Google participants, our Hangout participants. What is step one in your creative process as you begin a new work?
Okay. Well, now it's different than it was with the Center of Everything.
I'm going to change my question. What was it with the Center of Everything, and what is it now?
Okay.
Two-parter.
With the Center of Everything, I just started writing. It was just this very organic process, and that's why it took so long. That's why it was twice as long as it needed to be. It's not super plot heavy, right? Because I would just sort of write, and let's see where the characters go, that kind of writing. And it was good in its own ways, extremely time consuming, right? And I vowed with the next one, I thought, I'm going to have a plan before I start this one, and the metaphor I always think of is driving across country. You kind of want to know which roads you're going to take. It's not that you need to be crazy about staying on that route and never taking a detour, but it's a good idea. You're going to take 70 or 80. It's good. It's good to think about these things in advance, because you don't want to. I'm just going to go with the metaphor and be cheesy and say, you don't want a huge detour, but because they can be really time-consuming and frustrating, especially when you spend weeks or even months, thinking and going over a scene and making it perfect, and then realizing, wait, it doesn't even need to be in here. Right. And so now what I do is I do have an outline. And I write it, and I think about kind of the major arc. So it starts as this broad outline, what's the beginning, what's the middle, where's it going? And then I kind of think about the scenes and how those scenes would fit in there. And, does every scene actually belong? Because I don't want to be repetitive, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so to try to really cut the fat in it and really make it streamlined. At the same time, if something appears, you get these little gifts as you're writing, you have to go with it, or you might realize as you're writing, I thought that was a good idea, but it wasn't. But now I'm actually doing this thing, because I've read other authors do it, where I have a binder. So before I even started writing the book, I have a 3-ring binder full of 50 pages of outlines and notes and research.
Wow.
And I'm just going to move through the binder. And other authors do this, and I'm going to be interested. I think it's already saved me some time, because a lot of times.
So you've just started doing this?
Yeah, this is new for this new book. The last 2 ones I made an outline for.
Okay.
But now I'm getting like writing out these huge sort of treatments, you know, before I actually write it, because you can find out a lot of errors, you know, before you go through the work of actually writing it. We'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Questions from our Hangout participants?
Okay. Well, when you were writing The Center of Everything, was there ever a time where you were like, maybe this isn't going to work out? Like, maybe I shouldn't. This is.
Yeah. All the time. It was this weird combination. I think anybody who wants to do something like this, not necessarily even writing, but you have this big kind of weird project that you're doing that other people don't do. You feel crazy, you know, because sometimes I would feel so driven, like I'm going to do this, you know. I want to get this done so much. And I know at one point I made a pact with myself. You know, I was in my 20s. I'm like, I'm not going to go out at night until I finish it. And you know, I was that crazy. And what, you know, when I got that fellowship, I gave away everything I owned and drove to Exeter, New Hampshire, where I didn't know anybody. You know, I was pretty focused on getting this done. And at the same time, like you mentioned, I was having terrible doubts, you know, and especially because you have other people doubting you. Like I remember people would say, you know, I would sometimes, you know, people would say, what do you do? I'm a social worker. I also write. What are you writing? A novel. Oh, what have you published? You know, and you're like, I'm 23. You know what I mean? Like nothing yet. I'm working on it. And then you'd see that same person 3 years later, and they'd go, still working on your novel? And, you know, you'd be like, yes, I am, thanks, you know. But I had to keep working on it, and then you would feel lost. You would think, oh, it's not going to work out, and I've thrown away my 20s, and everybody else has done stuff that's making money, and I'm just, you know, going in circles, and this is stupid, this is so bad, this is terrible. And you would just have those arguments with yourself back and forth, and then it would make me go back and try to make it better again.
Were there ever any characters that like you had that you threw away, or like any scenes that you just like that were there?
Yep, hundreds of storylines, entire character arcs that never made it in. There was a guy, Hugh Lamont, was in the book. I remember him. He's gone.
Who's Hugh?
Hugh, he was this other boy that Evelyn went to school with. That was sort of this other character with his own arc, and he was sort of interesting. But I just remember at one point thinking, nope, he's got to go. Like, you know, I wanted to make it very streamlined. And then, you know, the people she met at college, they all go. You know, so it really changed a lot. Yeah. Here's something that's interesting that I forgot. Right. I was telling my husband when I was reading the book. My dog makes a cameo appearance in the book, which I totally forgot. But when I was in grad school, I had this crazy German Shepherd named Rita, and I put her in the book. And she's passed since then because she was old. But
sorry.
She's a real dog. Anyway, she made it in, but Hugh Lamont, boom.
That's cool.
When do I write? Well, you know, I am fortunate in that I work at a research university, and so I get time off from time to time. And when that happens, I like to keep kind of regular hours. You know, I like to write 9 to 4. I write when my daughter is at school. Okay. And then sometimes I'll stay up at night and edit. I don't like to write too late because I get tired. Right. And so I do a kind of a work-a-day system. I know that some people think that writers, you know, you stay up all night with a bottle of gin or something, and like that's just not happening for me. I kind of treat it like a job, and what I do with myself is I do 1,000 words a day.
1,000 words a day. Right,
which isn't that much. You know what I mean? It's doable. It's something you can get done. On days you really don't want to do it, you're like checking word count, you know. But if you do it, and then a lot of times you end up erasing it because it's no good. But you have to at least try to do that much. So it's kind of like working out. You know, you don't want to do it. You make yourself do it, and you're like, okay, I'm glad I did it. You know. But then it adds up after a while. Even if you're subtracting half of those words because you realize no. You kind of make progress slow and steady, and that's how I write.
Sure.
I have a question. When you write, like for this book, did you write in chronological order, like chapter by chapter, or do you like jump around to different events and then put it all together?
Really good
question. Know, that is a good question. With this first book, The Center of Everything, I did kind of do it that way because I started writing chapter 7 first based on that day at the Duchenne Clinic. Right. And then I went back in time, and then I went forward, and then I wrote all those pages, hundreds of page detours that I had to cut. And so it was kind of this big mess that I had to string together. Now I try to write in chronological order, just because it helps me think about things. So I have gone in this more streamlined, direction. And maybe that's a plus or a minus for my book. I don't know. It certainly saves time. It certainly saves you. I'd rather make the mistake in the outline than make it in the novel that takes so long to write, where you have to really think about the language. But other people, I know another writer, and she writes every sentence and perfects every sentence, and then moves on to the next sentence, having no idea where she is going. That's how she writes, and I write exactly the opposite, but to her that makes complete sense. And then I met another novelist, and she actually uses scissors to cut up paragraphs and then redistributes them into a novel. And she was telling me this, and I said, how does that work? And she was like, I don't see how it could not work. I don't see how anything else could work. So it's the idea that there's more than one way to do it, but I really like this chronology now. I find it saves me time and lets me think about themes.
We have another question from Chance on Twitter or Google Plus. Google Plus, sorry, Chance. Do you have any advice for those who want to write a novel but often find themselves losing their attention span to finish it?
Yeah. It sounds kind of harsh, but if you don't have the attention span to finish it, you're not going to. You're just not going to be the person who finishes a novel, because that's what holds people back. Is I meet a lot of students who are talented writers, and especially our graduate students. Their prose is amazing. I meet people all the time whose Facebook posts are way wittier than anything I could do, right? But most people don't have that stamina, that drive to I'm going to finish this. Like, most people bow out. It's like running a marathon, And I say this as someone who's never run a marathon, who's never going to run a marathon, and I think about it. But, a lot of people go, oh, I always think I could write a book. And you're like, maybe, but it does take this kind of crazy workhouse stamina. And I think even Faulkner said, talent schmalent, it's work ethic. And so if I would just scare myself, you know what I mean? I would think, okay, and I sometimes say this to myself when I want to screw around on the internet or do something dumb instead of doing my 1,000 words. I think, well, okay, nobody's going to make you, but then it's not going to get written. And that scares me enough. I kind of have this mean voice in my head that's like, you're going to be a big loser if you don't do this, or your story's never going to get told, and you got to do it, you got to do it. It's kind of like that chastising voice. And I think if you don't have that push, I meet students and I think, well, it's nice that you're taking the class, but.
Right, and I also hear you saying discipline. You have to be disciplined.
Very disciplined, yeah. And disciplined over the long haul.
Right.
So on that note, for especially a lot of young writers, I'm sure, who might have the potential and the stamina to eventually maybe get to that point where they want to write a novel, you still run into writer's block. Are there any tips or advice that you personally have to overcome that, or?
Well, specifically for a novel, and I think one of the most helpful books I've found for a novel is this book called 20 Master Plots, which sounds so reductive, right? 20 master plots, it's a form, right? And to be honest, I believe there's a picture of Jack and Rose of Titanic on the cover. But the book actually, uses the Odyssey and uses, Joseph Conrad's The Hero and the Thousand Faces, and really Billy Budd and really major works, and then also newer movies to show what the arc is like and why certain things are successful. What is it that readers are looking for, and sort of take apart the machinery behind so many books, because I think it is really important to think about structure. Now, if you read so much, if you're someone who just reads novels all the time, you meet students like this sometimes, and they just naturally know, because it's like a fluency with the language, and they just automatically know how a novel should rise and fall. But books like that, I think, are actually super helpful in helping you think about, I need an active protagonist. The protagonist needs to make a decision early on in the book that actually affects things early on. This is the crisis. This is what readers are looking for. And so I would actually really recommend a book like that. I think some of them can be really helpful. A lot of them will tell you how to read cookie cutter novels, and that's not what I'm saying at all, because even though this book says there are 20 master plots, there are thousands and thousands of combinations and unique possibilities for each of them. But it's like the revenge plot, the love story, transcendence, discovery, maturation, which is very much the center of everything. And that's what I would recommend. And then just the discipline to get it done. Yeah.
You've referenced Faulkner and Conrad. What do you like to read? Who's inspired you?
Well, let's see. For this book, The Center of Everything, I think the most important book I read, well, there were two. I read, for the prose, it was Sandra Cisneros, The House on Mango Street. I just love her. If you haven't read her,
I have not.
It's beautiful, and it's like 120 pages. It takes like 2 hours to read because it's so poetic in its language, and it's this little girl talking, and she is a Mexican immigrant 10-year-old living in Chicago. Beautiful, and her name is Esperanza, which is hope.
Okay, yeah.
So it's just beautiful. So I love her, and that really helped me. I think about the voice and the possibility for sort of telling it in this first person immediate. Even though Evelyn doesn't sound anything like Esperanza, but in some ways they kind of do. And then I read Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World, which just totally helped me with my theme. I really like Carl Sagan and his ideas. And Chase, I think you were saying you're doing environmental science.
I think that was Kelsey, but I'm doing civil engineering with an environmental focus. But yeah, I think it all ties the aspects together.
Yeah. And I guess he really got me thinking about how the reason for turning away from fundamentalism is not to put people down or make people feel inferior. It's because the earth is in jeopardy, and we have to think about our own choices and what we can do to make things better, because we are in such a difficult crisis situation right now, and we really have to take take control of the situation, in this sort of humanist perspective. But at the same time, he's so compassionate in the way he talks about people who think differently than he does, and why people believe, when he says the demon haunted world, he's talking about, before we had antibiotics, and it was a really scary world. And I think at one point in the book, Evelyn is realizing that her grandmother was one of 13 children, and 10 of them died. And that's actually true for my own family.
Yeah.
My grandmother's from Ireland and was one of 13, and I think 10 of them died, just being poor and no antibiotics. And so that would make for a person who might rely on maybe more superstition than true belief in reason, because if there is nothing to save you, then you just kind of make up something to save you, and you cling to that, because what else are you going to do when you've got a sick kid? So that book, but at the same time, he is so compassionate, such a wonderful, wonderful writer. I'm a huge fan of Carl Sagan.
Great. We have very little time left, about 8 minutes by my watch. And so we're going to move to the last theme, which is about first-year experience.
My first-year experience.
And so we'll ask our Google Hangout participants and our viewers on Google Plus and on Twitter to think about what they'd like to ask Laura about first year. And so you and I chatted a little bit before we came on live about that, and I was wondering if you could maybe just talk a little bit about the start. How about the beginning of your first year?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Howard asked me, he said, how was your first year? And I was like, oh, it was miserable. Like, when I first got here, I was so excited to be here. That scene where Evelyn walks down Jinghak Boulevard and then she goes to the museum, it was that same kind of intoxicating, like, oh my God, I am so, so excited to finally be here and not in my little town and be around all this energy and this intellectual curiosity. This is great. So that was all wonderful, but I lived off campus. My parents wanted me to live at home because I was still 17, and I didn't have a car, and it was really hard to meet people. I remember that, because I think the living situation helps you meet people, and if you don't live on campus, it's pretty tough coming from Montana. So I'd sort of hang out and try to talk to people. It never worked, It was really embarrassing, hey, and it just didn't work. It was hard. And I was telling you then, I saved my money. I got a job at the Alumni Center as a waitress. I was a banquet server, so I met a lot of other student waiters and waitresses, and that was a wonderful job, and they fed us. And then I saved up enough money to move into a dorm, and that was great, because then I met people who are still my friends today. I met people from all different countries, and that was a wonderful. And then I just loved going to all the classes, and I didn't really have a serious major my first year. I wasn't sure. And then it was pre-med and social work. I took all these pre-med courses, and now look at this. I teach creative writing and I write novels. So, sometimes people know what they want to do early on, and they focus and they go for it. But I think it's okay to be open to change and be open to new experiences.
Questions from our participants?
No, that's really cool. Now, when you're in a serious major, well, no, I mean, not to say it's not serious, but when you have majors like creative writing, then you like see on the other end of the spectrum pre-med. I guess my question is, what's one thing to expect in different teaching styles between like coming from high school and then going to college? Like, what's the one thing that is for sure going to be different?
Good question, Chase.
I don't know if this is true for everybody. That is a good question, but it seemed to me it was a little bit more sink or swim, a little bit. But here's the other thing. When I was in high school, I didn't really care about grades or anything. I didn't go to, I don't know, I skipped a lot. I didn't take, I know, I was bad. You know, I was interested in stuff, and I wasn't a terrible student, but I was, you know, not really giving it my all. And then when I got to KU, I was so excited to be here, and I remember thinking, what would happen if I really tried? Like, what would happen if I didn't put myself in this box as this sort of not, you know, not a person who doesn't try as hard as she can? What would happen if I sat in the front row, if I went to every class, if I went to every study session? Like, just what would happen? And I did it, and I surprised myself, you know? I was like, oh, like, this will work. And what I learned about KU, my advice would be, is, you know, some of these classes are really big, right? And you can feel lost, and you'll see people in the back row reading the UDK. If you sit up front, if you sit in the front row, it becomes a very small class, right? You kind of forget all those people, and you can interact with the professor. You can go into office hours. You know, you can make even a big class seem small and personalized to you. And if you show up every day and interact with the instructor, I think you're going to get like this really good education. You know, you can get it here. And I feel like that's what I decided to do, and I'm so glad that I did it in time.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Any other questions from our Hangout participants?
What was your favorite part about KU?
Oh.
Like anything.
My favorite part? That's hard. You know, I did get so many of the classes, but I you know, off the top of my head, and maybe I'll regret this later, I really liked the dorm, because I felt like that's where I did a lot of learning outside the classroom. You know, you're learning to get along with people. You're learning to kind of be on your own. You know, there's so many different kinds of people, and I know some people hated it. I loved it because I loved all the interaction, and to me, it was just so much fun. And, you know, I got a single pretty quickly, but you know, like my sophomore year. And then I was an RA, and I really liked that. I felt like that taught me a lot on the job. So I did like the living experiences and making the friends that I still have now. But, you know, also the classroom experiences. I did get to study abroad. You know, I did all this great stuff. I took horseback riding lessons. You know, I took Peoples of Africa. You know, and I took organic chemistry. And I don't know if that would say that was my favorite experience, but I did sort of surprise myself that I could keep up, you know? So it's hard for me to say just one thing. I'll probably think of it later, like, oh, this was the best moment. But I just loved it, you know, obviously, because I keep coming back.
I think that's a perfect question to end on. So I want to say some thanks. First off, thanks to the Spencer Museum of Art, the wonderful and lovely Spencer Museum of Art, which hosted us today. And I want to point out back here the Palissy platter, which is this green platter behind Laura and me, which is the 2014-2015 KU Common Work of Art. It's 16th century French platter that is actually casted from live animals, though none were harmed in the making of the platter. And you should definitely stop by the Spencer Museum of Art. Visit the museum, see the platter, and we'll have a wonderful event here called Is This Real Life on September 11th, so look for information about that. I want to thank the Google Hangout participants, Chase and Jessica and Kelsey.
Thank you.
Wonderful questions. Great job. And I want to thank the folks that contributed and watched and listened and participated from Twitter and Google+. And most especially I want to thank you, Laura, for your time today. And you can hear Laura speak again on Thursday, October 23rd at 7:30 in the Leeds Center. She'll also speak the following morning on October 24th in the Natural History Museum. And lastly, want to make sure that everyone brings their book with them to school, because on August 21st we're going to have our KU Common Book discussions in the residence halls. So thanks again, Laura. Thank you everyone for their time, and we'll see everybody very soon on campus.
See ya.
Yeah, bye.